human guided the alien girl through the ash fields, but her status made him a target for assassins. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, back to our main character. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren, ashen landscape. The wind howled, sending particles of soot and dust swirling in every direction. Jake Williams squinted against the stinging gusts, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, dark earth beneath him. The battlefield that stretched out before him was still, a ghostly reminder of the violence that had once taken place here. All around, the air felt thick with the weight of death and destruction. He glanced over at the girl walking beside him. Zara was unlike any human he had ever met. Her skin shimmered with a faint, ethereal glow, a deep blue hue that was unlike anything he had seen before. Her eyes, large and violet, looked both ancient and wise, though tinged with the fear of someone who had been betrayed by her own people. She had the air of royalty, though she had never once spoken of her status. She had been on the run for days, hiding from enemies that sought to capture her for her bloodline significance in the alien empire. Jake had no idea who she really was, but in that moment, it didn't matter. She was vulnerable, and Jake felt an overwhelming sense of duty to protect her. He was just a regular man, no special training, no elite background. He was a soldier, but not a hero. Yet, here he was, guiding a mysterious alien girl through the ruined, desolate fields, with nothing but his wits and basic survival skills to rely on. As they walked, Zara's breathing came in short, strained bursts. She had been injured during their escape, her leg wounded in an earlier skirmish. Jake wanted to pick her up and carry her to safety, but the risks were too great. If he moved too fast, if they were spotted, it could all be over. His eyes darted to the horizon, watching for any signs of movement. They had to keep moving. Every second felt like it could be their last. The sky above was a dark, ominous grey, and the field stretched on endlessly, each step a reminder of how far they had come, how much they had lost. Zara, despite her obvious pain, never once complained. She held herself with a dignity that only made Jake more determined to get her to safety. He had no idea why he was doing this. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But looking at Zara, knowing what she represented, he couldn't bring himself to turn away. Not when she needed him most. As they trudged through the ash, Jake's mind raced. He didn't know who was after them, only that the moment they were discovered, his life would change forever. Zara had something that made her worth killing, something Jake could only guess at. She was royalty, yes, but her true power was far greater than that. She was someone who could bring worlds to their knees, or tear them apart. And Jake? He was just the man who had chosen to help her. The sound of distant engines in the sky made him freeze. He turned to Zara, his face hardening with resolve. "We have to move faster," he whispered, his voice tense. Zara nodded, her face a mask of determination despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Together, they continued on, each step taking them deeper into the dangerous unknown. The wind howled louder now, biting at Jake's skin as they continued their trek across the ashen wasteland. Zara, despite her struggles, kept pace, her footsteps light but calculated. Every now and then, she would wince as she put weight on her injured leg, but she never once asked for help. Her resolve was undeniable. Jake admired her strength, though it weighed heavily on his conscience. She was royalty, no doubt. He had seen the way others treated her, the way her mere presence commanded respect, even from the enemy. But now, here she was, relying on him to get her out of this hellhole. He wasn't sure why he was helping her. Maybe it was the fact that she reminded him of someone he used to care for, someone who had once looked at him the same way Zara did now, with a trust that was hard to earn and harder to keep. But whatever the reason, he couldn't stop. They had to keep moving. His instincts told him they weren't alone, the danger was closing in. The distant hum of engines in the sky grew louder, and Jake's grip on his pulse rifle tightened. He glanced at Zara, her violet eyes scanning the horizon, as if she too could sense the looming threat. "We have to find cover," Jake muttered under his breath. Zara nodded, but there was no urgency in her movements. She seemed at peace with her fate, as though the only thing left for her to do was to trust in Jake. They reached the edge of a ruined building, a once sturdy structure now nothing more than a skeleton of metal and stone. Jake ducked behind a crumbled wall, signaling for Zara to follow. She did, her movement slow but deliberate. They crouched low, trying to avoid detection as they watched the sky above. Jake's pulse quickened as the sound of the engines grew louder. Whoever was chasing them, they were getting closer. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and ready. Zara shifted beside him, her eyes fixed on the sky. "They're coming," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange calmness. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had known they were being hunted, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel all too real. He couldn't let them catch her. Not when they were so close to escaping. "Stay close," Jake whispered, as he carefully peered over the edge of the wall. Through the smoke and ash, he could just make out the silhouette of a ship, its dark hull slicing through the clouds. It was big, and it was heading straight for them. Zara reached out and touched his arm, a gesture that startled him. "They won't stop until I'm in their hands," she said, her tone resolute but tinged with sorrow. Jake's jaw clenched. He wasn't about to let that happen. Not on his watch. He had no idea what kind of power Zara wielded, but he knew one thing for sure: she wasn't just some pawn to be sacrificed. She was a person, and he was going to protect her with everything he had. The ship above made its descent, its engines roaring like a beast from another world. Jake's grip on his rifle tightened once more. It was time to move. They couldn't stay here any longer. He stood, signaling for Zara to follow, and together, they sprinted toward a narrow alleyway that led deeper into the ruins. The sound of the engines behind them was deafening now, and Jake could feel the weight of their pursuers closing in. Zara's breath was shallow, but she kept up with him, her eyes never leaving his back. For the first time since their escape began, Jake felt a flicker of hope. They were not alone in this fight. And as long as they had each other, they would survive. He just had to keep them both one step ahead of the danger, keep Zara safe long enough for them to escape this nightmare. But even as they ran, Jake knew the true battle was only just beginning. They ran through the narrow alleyway, the sound of boots pounding against the cracked ground echoing in the silence of the ruined city. Jake's heart was racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he pushed himself to run faster. Zara, despite her injuries, was keeping up, her feet light on the ground but her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Jake shot a quick glance back at her. "How are you holding up?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Zara nodded, her face set with determination. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was strained. "Keep going." They darted past a collapsed building, its skeletal frame casting long shadows in the fading light. Jake could hear the distant hum of the engines, closer now, almost overhead. They didn't have much time. Zara's strength was impressive, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the exhaustion caught up with her. They had to find a way to lose their pursuers. They reached a dead end, a crumbling wall in front of them. Jake cursed under his breath. "We need to move fast," he muttered, scanning the surroundings. A few feet to the left, he noticed a rusted hatch, barely visible beneath the debris. Without hesitation, he grabbed Zara's arm, pulling her toward it. "This way!" They reached the hatch just as the roar of the ship above them grew louder. Jake quickly yanked open the hatch, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. Zara hesitated for a moment, her violet eyes flicking up at him. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice for the first time. "We don't have a choice," Jake said firmly. He motioned for her to go first. "I'll cover you." Zara stepped into the passage, and Jake followed closely behind, pulling the hatch closed just in time. The underground tunnel was damp and cold, the walls lined with old pipes and remnants of long-abandoned equipment. They moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick layers of dust and grime that covered the floor. Jake led the way, his senses alert for any signs of danger. He could feel the weight of the chase pressing on him, the knowledge that they were still being hunted gnawing at the back of his mind. Zara, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. She moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the darkened tunnel ahead as though she had walked this path before. After what felt like an eternity, they came to a small, dimly lit room. Jake stepped inside, taking a moment to catch his breath. "This should be safer now," he said, wiping the sweat from his brow. Zara didn't respond immediately. She was standing near the far wall, her back to him, her posture tense. He could see her shoulders rising and falling with each breath, and her face was pale, her earlier calm replaced with a subtle unease. Jake took a step toward her, concern etched on his face. "Zara, are you okay?" he asked softly. She turned to him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "They won't stop," she said quietly, her voice filled with a strange mix of resignation and determination. "They'll keep coming, no matter where we hide." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll just have to keep moving. As long as we're together, we have a chance." Zara gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I believe you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. In that moment, he knew that no matter what happened, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. They had a long road ahead, but they weren't alone in this fight. And as long as they stayed one step ahead, they might just survive this nightmare. The sound of footsteps approaching the room made them both freeze. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle, ready to defend Zara at all costs. But as the door creaked open, a familiar voice called out from the darkness. "Jake? Zara?" It was a voice Jake didn't expect to hear, one that sent a wave of relief washing over him. He stepped forward cautiously, his rifle lowered. "Who's there?" he called out. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a familiar face, one that Jake hadn't seen in years. It was his old comrade, Mark, a fellow soldier he thought had died in the last battle. Mark's eyes widened in surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, taking in the sight of Jake and Zara. "Looks like we found each other again." Jake didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He had hope for help, but never imagined it would come in the form of an old friend. But now, with Mark's unexpected appearance, maybe, just maybe, they had a real shot at surviving this after all. Mark stepped further into the dimly lit room, his boots making a soft thud against the floor. Jake's eyes narrowed as he studied his old comrade, trying to process what had just happened. He had thought Mark was gone, lost to the chaos of the last battle. But here he was, alive, standing in front of him like a ghost from the past. "Mark," Jake said, his voice steady but with a hint of disbelief. "I thought you were. You were dead." Mark smiled wryly, his face a little grimmer than Jake remembered, but the same familiar spark in his eyes remained. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Turns out, the reports of my death were exaggerated," he said with a dry chuckle. "Long story short, I managed to get out of there, and I've been following your trail ever since. Looks like I came just in time." Jake was about to ask more, but his thoughts were interrupted by Zara, who had been standing silently beside him. She took a cautious step forward, her gaze shifting between the two men. "And you are?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with curiosity. Mark turned to her, his eyes taking in her alien features for a moment before he nodded. "Mark Collins, at your service." "You must be Zara." Zara gave a small, polite nod, her expression unreadable. Jake couldn't help but notice the tension in her posture, the guarded way she stood, as though she was ready to move at a moment's notice. It was clear she didn't trust Mark entirely, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made Jake feel a bit better. Zara didn't speak for a moment, instead studying Mark closely, her violet eyes searching his face for any sign of deceit. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady. "Why are you here, Mark Collins?" What do you want? Mark raised his hands in a gesture of peace. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. I've got no interest in your status or whatever you've got going on. I'm here to help Jake, and that's it. Jake watched as Zara considered his words carefully. She wasn't convinced, but she didn't push him away either. Instead, she seemed to let the moment hang in the air, her gaze flicking back to Jake. We don't have time for games, she said, her voice now edged with urgency. They are still after us. Mark nodded, his expression growing serious. I know, he said. And that's why I'm here. I've been tracking you for days. You're not alone in this anymore. We can make it out of here, together. Jake glanced at Zara, who still seemed unsure. But she didn't argue. After a moment, she gave a small nod, accepting the help, albeit reluctantly. All right, she said, her tone calm but firm. We move now. The three of them quickly gathered what little they had left, preparing to leave the underground room. Mark led the way, taking the lead in the narrow tunnel with Jake and Zara close behind. As they moved, Jake couldn't help but wonder what Mark had been through in the time they had been apart. The man was different, his eyes were darker, haunted, as if he had seen things that would never leave him. It wasn't the Mark Jake remembered, the one who had always been quick with a joke and had never taken things too seriously. No, this version of Mark was hardened, a survivor in the truest sense. As they reached a junction in the tunnel, Mark stopped and motioned for them to follow. We'll head to the old city ruins. It's off the grid, hidden from most sensors. It's our best shot at staying under the radar. Jake nodded, though a part of him was still skeptical. He trusted Mark, but the situation was far from ideal. They couldn't stay hidden forever. And with Zara's status still unknown to Mark, Jake wondered just how much of this situation was luck and how much was fate pushing them all together. They moved quickly through the tunnels, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick, damp air. Zara kept close to Jake, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Jake didn't blame her, he felt the same way. The closer they got to the city ruins, the more uneasy he became. It was too quiet, almost too perfect. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap, that the worst was yet to come. But for now, they had no choice but to keep moving. Mark had led them this far, and they had to trust that he knew what he was doing. The air grew heavier, the scent of rust and decay filling their lungs as they neared their destination. Jake's hand instinctively went to the sidearm at his waist, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. They were on the run. They were in danger. And yet, with Zara by his side and Mark leading the way, there was still a glimmer of hope. The ruins loomed ahead, silent and waiting. Whatever happened next, they had to be ready. They reached the outskirts of the old city ruins, the crumbling structures looming ahead like forgotten giants. The air smelled of ancient dust and decay, with the scent of rust and dampness heavy in the atmosphere. Jake's eyes scanned the horizon, the feeling of being watched settling over him like a weight. He couldn't shake the sense that they were close to danger, that every corner of this forgotten place held secrets they weren't ready to uncover. Mark led the way, his steps steady and confident, though his posture had an edge of tension, as if he, too, could feel the looming threat. Zara walked beside Jake, her pace slower now. Despite her composure, he could see the strain in her face, the exhaustion that was starting to take its toll. She hadn't spoken much since they entered the tunnel, but Jake knew she was still processing everything. The truth of who she was, and the danger it brought, was something neither of them could fully understand. This way, Mark said, his voice low as he gestured toward a collapsed building. We'll make camp here for the night. Jake hesitated. The building was a shelter of sorts, but something about it felt off. The walls were cracked, and the remnants of what had once been windows were now empty holes, exposing the inside to the harsh wind. Still, it was better than staying out in the open. Let's move, Jake muttered, nodding to Mark. They made their way inside, stepping carefully around the debris. The room they found was small but functional, enough to offer some shelter from the elements. Mark quickly began setting up a small camp, pulling out what little gear he had, while Jake did the same, keeping an eye on Zara. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Zara gave a small nod, her eyes momentarily meeting his before she turned away, her gaze drifting over the ruined walls. "I've been better," she said quietly. "But I'll survive." Jake wasn't sure what to say to that. The weight of her words hung between them, as heavy as the silence that followed. They sat in the dim light, the crackling of a small fire the only sound in the otherwise still room. Mark glanced at both of them before speaking. "You've both got questions," he said, his tone serious. "And I don't blame you. I know you're wondering how I found you, how I managed to survive all this time. It's a long story, but the short version is that I've been keeping an eye on the people who were behind the attack on you, Zara." Zara's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with surprise. "You know who they are?" she asked, her voice a mixture of hope and skepticism. Mark nodded grimly. "I've had my own reasons for being in the shadows. There are things happening in the galaxy, things that even your people don't know about yet. And your family's involvement in it, well, it's bigger than you think." Jake's mind raced. He had always known that the stakes were high, but hearing Mark confirm it made everything feel so much more real. They weren't just running from a few enemies, they were caught in the middle of something much larger, something that could change everything. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice steady, though the uncertainty was creeping in. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There are factions out there, forces pulling strings, and you, Zara, are right in the middle of it. Your family, your bloodline, it's not just about power. It's about control. Control over something that could shift the balance of the galaxy." Zara's gaze darkened as she processed his words. "So, they want me dead because of my bloodline," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark's eyes softened, but he nodded. "Yes. But not just you. They want anyone connected to your family. And they'll stop at nothing to get it." The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy blanket, the realization hitting them all at once. Jake felt his heart race as he processed the implications. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future. And Zara was at the center of it all. As the night wore on, they spoke little, each lost in their own thoughts, the fire crackling softly between them. The uncertainty of what the next day would bring was overwhelming, but one thing was clear, they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to move again, find a way to stay one step ahead of the enemies that hunted Zara. Jake knew this wasn't the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. The morning light filtered weakly through the cracks in the ruined building, casting long shadows across the makeshift camp. Jake woke first, his body stiff from the cold, his mind still racing with the conversation from the night before. He rubbed his face with one hand, trying to shake off the weariness that clung to him. The weight of their situation hadn't sunk in completely until Mark's words echoed in his mind again. Zara's family wasn't just a target, they were the key to something much larger, something that could alter the course of everything. As Jake stood, stretching his sore muscles, he noticed Zara was already awake. She sat near the fire, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Her gaze flicked to him as he approached, but she didn't say anything. There was an air of quiet between them, the unspoken understanding that they were caught in something bigger than they could comprehend. Jake cleared his throat, stepping closer. "We need to keep moving," he said softly, not wanting to break the silence too abruptly. Zara nodded without looking up, the faintest trace of exhaustion in her features. "I know," she replied. "I just need a moment." Jake didn't push her. She'd been through so much already, and the last thing he wanted was to make her feel pressured. He took a seat across from her, watching the fire crackle. It was a brief moment of calm, a small respite in the chaos. Mark, who had been inspecting their gear, looked over at them. "We've got to make it to the safe house by nightfall," he said, his voice serious. "It's not far, but the longer we wait here, the more likely it is we'll be caught." Jake nodded, standing up again. "Let's go." Zara hesitated for a moment, then rose to her feet as well. Her movements were careful, the injury in her leg still bothering her, but she pushed through it with quiet determination. They gathered their things quickly, each of them aware of the time slipping away. Mark led the way, with Jake and Zara following closely behind. As they moved deeper into the ruins, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every crackling sound in the distance made him tense, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Zara, too, seemed on edge. Her eyes darted around, her senses attuned to any sign of danger. "What exactly is this safe house?" Jake asked as they walked. Mark glanced back, his face hardening. "It's a place used by a network of people who want to see Zara's family fall. We'll be safe there, at least for a little while." Jake wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't have a better option. The ruins around them were too exposed, and the feeling of being trapped was growing heavier by the second. They reached the edge of the ruins and approached a narrow alleyway that led into an underground bunker. Mark paused for a moment, scanning the surroundings before signaling for them to follow. As they entered the underground passage, the air grew colder, the musty smell of old stone and metal filling their nostrils. The bunker was small, but it had been well maintained. The walls were lined with crates and supplies, and a few people were already there, quietly speaking in hushed tones. One of them, a woman with short cropped hair, looked up as they entered. Her eyes lingered on Zara for a moment before she nodded at Mark. "We've been expecting you." Mark gave a terse nod in return. "Keep an eye out. There are others looking for her." The woman didn't respond, but her eyes held an unspoken understanding. Jake watched Zara, who was now leaning against the wall, her breathing shallow from the exertion. She was trying to keep it together, but he could see the strain on her face. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, he moved to the other side of the room and began unpacking their gear. Time was running out, and they couldn't afford to relax for too long. As the hours passed, the tension in the room grew. Every movement felt deliberate, every sound amplified in the silence. Jake's mind raced, running through every possible outcome, every plan of escape. He didn't know how long they would be safe here, but he knew they couldn't stay long. They had to keep moving, always staying one step ahead of the people hunting Zara. The thought of being trapped again, of having nowhere to go, made his stomach twist. But as he looked across the room at Zara, he knew there was no turning back. He had made a promise to protect her, and no matter what came next, he would see it through. The faint hum of a distant engine reached their ears, and Jake's body tensed. Zara's head snapped up at the sound, her eyes meeting his with an expression he couldn't quite place. Fear? Recognition? He couldn't tell. But they both knew the same thing, the danger was closing in again, and they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The hum of the distant engine grew louder, sending a wave of tension through the small room. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the rifle slung over his shoulder, his mind racing. He could feel the air shift around him, the weight of every breath heavier as the seconds ticked by. Zara's eyes flicked to him, her face a mask of concentration. She could hear it too, the same way he did. They weren't alone anymore. Mark, who had been silent for most of the last few hours, spoke up, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move, now," he said, his gaze darting toward the exit. "They're getting closer." Jake looked at Zara, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. There was no time for words, no time for questions. She nodded, understanding the unspoken message. They had to leave. Now. Mark moved toward the door first, his footsteps swift and sure. Jake followed, pulling Zara along with him. She didn't resist, her body moving on instinct as they navigated through the bunker's narrow corridors. The sound of footsteps echoed in the dark, and Jake's heart raced as he heard the low rumble of something approaching, something big. They reached a small hatch hidden behind a stack of crates. Mark quickly went to work, prying it open with a swift motion. "This way," he urged, glancing over his shoulder. Jake didn't hesitate. He shoved Zara ahead of him, following closely behind as they squeezed through the hatch and into the cold night air. The world outside was eerily quiet, the ruins standing in the moonlight like ancient sentinels. They were exposed now, more than ever. Jake's eye scanned the surroundings, every corner, every shadow. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end, as if someone, or something, was watching them. "We need to move fast," Jake muttered, his voice tight with urgency. Zara, though still limping slightly, nodded without a word, her steps quickening as she pushed forward. They had no choice but to trust Mark and keep moving. Mark led them through the ruins, his movement swift and purposeful. Jake kept his eyes on the horizon, knowing they couldn't afford to be caught in the open. The soft crunch of their footsteps on the dust and debris was the only sound accompanying them as they moved deeper into the old city. "Where exactly are we going?" Jake asked, his voice sharp. Mark glanced over his shoulder, his face hardening. "There's a safe house not far from here," he said. "We should be able to make it there before they catch up." "We don't have much time," Zara interjected, her voice barely above a whisper. "They'll be on us any minute." Jake didn't need to say anything, they all knew the stakes. The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of their situation pressing down on each of them. As they rounded a corner, Mark stopped abruptly, raising a hand to signal for them to halt. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the area. "There's movement ahead," he whispered, his voice tight. Jake felt a jolt of panic. He scanned the path in front of them, his mind racing. The dim light from the moon made it difficult to see, but the shadows were moving. "How many?" Jake asked, his grip tightening on his rifle. Mark held up 3 fingers, signaling that there were 3 figures up ahead. Jake's stomach twisted. "What do we do now?" he whispered, trying to keep his voice steady. Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked to Zara, who was standing just behind them, her face pale and tense. She looked like she was ready to run, but Mark held up a hand. "Stay low," he ordered. "We can't afford to get spotted. If we move fast enough, we can slip past them." Jake nodded, his heart pounding. He looked at Zara once more, silently urging her to follow his lead. Together, they crouched low, their footsteps barely making a sound as they crept forward. The shadows ahead shifted again, and Jake's pulse quickened. Every sense was on high alert as they moved through the ruins, their bodies pressed close to the walls, avoiding any open space where they could be seen. They were almost there. Jake could feel the weight of the moment, every second counted now. The figures up ahead didn't seem to notice them yet, but Jake knew it wouldn't be long before they did. They needed to make it to the safe house, and fast. As they moved closer, the sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. It was now or never. Mark held up a fist, signaling for them to stop. Jake's eyes darted to him. "On my signal," Mark whispered. They crouched lower, waiting for the right moment. Time seemed to stretch, every heartbeat thundering in Jake's ears. Then, Mark gave a sharp nod, and they moved. The 3 of them sprinted forward, moving faster than they had before, their bodies light and agile as they cut through the shadows. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was growing louder, but they didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. The safe house was within reach, just a few more steps. But the danger was closing in fast. Jake felt the weight of the moment press down on him. This was it. The fight for their survival was just beginning. The safe house was just ahead, a nondescript building hidden between 2 taller structures, its entrance concealed behind a thick curtain of ivy. Jake's breath came in short gasps as he pushed forward, his legs burning from the sprint. The sound of their pursuers was still close, but they had to make it to the door before it was too late. Mark led the way, his movements quick and sure, while Jake kept pace, with Zara just behind him. The urgency of the situation pressed down on them all like a weight. They reached the entrance, and Mark wasted no time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, pressing it against the door frame. There was a soft click, and the door swung open. "Get in, now," Mark urged, his voice tight with urgency. Jake shoved Zara ahead of him and followed closely behind. The door closed behind them with a soft thud, sealing them inside. They were in a small, dimly lit room, the air stale and cool. The walls were bare, save for a few shelves filled with supplies. The faint hum of electricity filled the space, providing just enough light for them to see. Mark turned to them, his expression hard. "We're safe for now, but we can't stay long. They're going to keep looking." Jake nodded, his mind already racing through their options. "What's the plan?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Mark exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "We need to move again, but not yet. The people after Zara are smart. They won't just give up. We need to lay low, rest, and plan our next move carefully." Zara, who had been silent since they entered, spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "How long do we have?" Mark's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Jake saw a flicker of something softer in Mark's gaze, concern, maybe, or understanding. "A few hours, at most," he said. "Then we need to get moving again." Zara nodded, her posture rigid but composed. "Fine," she said, her voice carrying a sense of finality. "I'll rest, but only for a short while." Jake watched her for a moment, her quiet determination resonating with him. She had been through so much, yet she still held herself with such strength. "We all need to rest," he said, turning back to Mark. "But we also need information. What do we know about the people after Zara?" Mark's face darkened as he sat down on one of the crates near the wall. "Not much, but I know they're well organized. They're not just bounty hunters or mercenaries. This is bigger than that. Whoever they work for has a lot of power, and they'll do anything to get Zara." Zara's gaze flicked to the floor, her jaw tightening. "They won't stop until I'm dead," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Jake's heart clenched at her words, but he kept his voice steady. "We're not going to let that happen," he said firmly. Zara met his eyes then, her expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a quiet appreciation, maybe. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice low. "But I promise you, I won't let them win." Jake gave a small nod, the weight of her words settling in his chest. "We're in this together," he said simply. Mark, who had been listening quietly, stood up and walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room. "We need to find out who's behind this," he said, his voice resolute. "If we can figure that out, we can take them down. But first, we need to rest. We're all exhausted." Jake nodded in agreement, though his mind was already racing with thoughts of what to do next. They couldn't afford to let their guard down, but for now, they had no choice but to rest. The time they had in the safe house was their only chance to regroup. As he sat down against the wall, Jake glanced over at Zara. She was staring out the small window, her expression distant. He couldn't imagine what she was feeling, what it must be like to be hunted, to be the target of something far bigger than yourself. But one thing was certain, he would stand by her, no matter what. They were in this together, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. As the minutes ticked by, the room grew quieter, the only sound the faint hum of electricity and the distant wind. But the silence was heavy with the weight of their situation, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closing in on them faster than they realized. They had no time to waste. Whatever came next, they had to be ready. The hours passed slowly in the safe house, the oppressive silence of the room only broken by the occasional sound of shifting crates or the distant hum of the city outside. Jake sat against the wall, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan. They were safe for now, but he knew that wouldn't last. The enemy was relentless, and they were closing in faster than he'd like to admit. Zara sat across the room, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Jake couldn't help but notice how much weight she carried. She wasn't just a princess or a target, she was someone who had been thrust into a world she hadn't chosen, caught between powers greater than herself. And now, it was up to them to protect her. He stood up slowly, stretching his stiff limbs. "We can't stay here forever," he muttered to himself, more to break the silence than anything. Zara looked up at him, her violet eyes meeting his. "I know," she replied quietly. "But we need to be careful. They're watching every move we make." Jake nodded, his mind working quickly. I know. That's why we have to keep moving, but we need information. We can't just run forever. Mark, who had been quietly observing the situation, stood up and walked over to them. Jake's right, he said, his voice calm but firm. We can't just hide. We need to find out who's behind all of this, and more importantly, why they want you dead. Zara's gaze flicked to him, her expression hardening. You think I don't know that, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. I've been running my whole life, always looking over my shoulder. But now it's different. They're not just hunting me, they're hunting everything I stand for. The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone took in her words. Jake understood. Zara wasn't just a person to them, she was a symbol, a key to something larger. Her bloodline was important, and that made her a target for more than just assassins. It made her a pawn in a much larger game. Mark broke the silence, his voice low and serious. We need to get to the root of this. Find out who's pulling the strings. But we can't do that by sitting here and waiting. We'll need to move, get to the next safe house, and from there, start gathering intel. Zara stood up, her movement slow but purposeful. Then we move, she said, her voice steady. I'm not hiding anymore. If they want me, they'll have to come and get me. Jake watched her for a moment, admiration and worry mixing in his chest. She had a quiet strength that he didn't fully understand, but he knew it was the only thing keeping her going. All right, he said finally. Let's get moving. Mark nodded and moved to the door, checking outside before motioning for them to follow. They stepped out into the cold night air, the world outside still as silent as the ruins they had left behind. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way through the narrow streets. The city was quiet, too quiet for Jake's liking. It felt like the calm before the storm. As they walked, Zara kept a few paces ahead, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. It was clear she wasn't just relying on them to keep her safe, she was watching out for them too. After several minutes of tense silence, Mark stopped abruptly, holding up a hand to signal them to halt. He turned to Jake and Zara. There's a safe house nearby. We need to lay low for the night, gather information, and figure out our next move. Zara nodded without speaking, but Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes. They had been running for days now, and the weight of it was starting to show. We rest, Jake said quietly, but not for long. We'll need to stay sharp. They continued toward the safe house, each of them knowing that the moment they stopped moving, the danger would catch up with them. It was only a matter of time. But for now, all they could do was keep moving forward, always one step ahead of the enemy. The safe house loomed ahead, an old building nestled between two larger structures, hidden in the shadows. It looked unassuming, but to Jake, it was a lifeline. They stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind them. Inside, the air was cool and dry, the only sound the faint hum of electricity running through the walls. Mark took a quick look around, then turned to them. We'll rest here tonight. In the morning, we'll figure out our next move. Jake nodded, his mind already working on their options. There was no time to waste. They couldn't hide forever. And whatever came next, he was ready to face it, with Zara, and with Mark, by his side.